Ooh, I believe that I am now live. Okay, it's been a little while since I've done one of these live streams, so excuse any hiccups. I no longer have webcam on my main PC, so I'm using my laptop at the moment, so I apologise for the slightly poorer video quality than what people might be used to. We reached 75% funding the other day. We are actually now, let me just double check, we're actually now at 84% funded, which is incredibly exciting. That's, let's see, that is £2,104 of the £2,500 goal, which is amazing. That's 78 backers altogether in just the last 4 days of this Kickstarter going live. And before I even get started on the Q&A, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's pledged so far. This book has been a long time coming. The last volume came out, well, it went on Kickstarter in 2014 in October, and it was published in 2015. And obviously that's 6 years now since the last Kickstarter, and a lot has happened in those 6 years. I like to think my writing have developed, and consequently this is a much longer book than the first book. It's at 80 pages, still 10 stories, 12 characters that I really can't wait to introduce to all of you. I promised the backers that I would be doing a live stream once we reach 75%, so here we are. This is sort of done like a bit of an informal question and answer session with a couple of questions that have been sent in by people on my Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and things like that. So let's get started with those. The first question was, how many stories do you have in that head of yours? That was from my mum via Instagram. So the answer to that is too many. Far too many to get down all at once. One of the reasons I love writing short stories so much is it gets me a chance to sort of go in and out of different characters' minds and different worlds and different time periods, and just experiment with them and have fun and sort of make what I like to call, or what I've called over the years when I've displayed Cirque Du Mort at various conventions, is a collage of horror stories. So, for example, in volume 1, one of the stories I did was very much based on the sort of interview question and answer sort of thing, which was Callista. And she had an interviewer who was asking her questions. And then you had things like poems. We also had things done in sort of first person. So varying different styles. So it's just a good fun to sort of try my hand at different things. Going back to the question, for Cirque Du Mort, I was originally thinking of doing 5 volumes, which would be 50 stories, 20 of which have already obviously been written, 10 for this one and 10 for the last one. But I've never wanted to cement that or commit to it too much, because obviously some of those will change and evolve in different ways. Some of them I might not think are necessarily suitable for a horror anthology anymore. Some of them might develop into romances or into dramas. Some of them may want to go out of the realms of the circus and into something different. There was one story that I was writing for this anthology that I was really excited by and I was really enjoying writing. And after a good few days of sort of writing the short story, I realised that this wasn't very short anymore. It was turning into something bigger and more exciting. So that one is no longer going to be in the Cirque Du Mort world, but definitely one that I want to revisit in the future. So the answer to that question is basically just too many. Lots. Okay, next question. It's a little bit of a longer one. Jump scares and sudden shocking images are staples of horror cinema. Since that presumably isn't possible in a piece of writing, what else is in your toolbox to make a story horrifying? This is a classic conundrum in the difference between obviously horror literature and horror film is you have the jump scare. A few people might say that it's the jump scare is considered the cheap scare. I love jump scares. I find them hysterically funny and generally laugh straight after them because it's a great form of getting the adrenaline pumping. Obviously, in a book, that's difficult, nigh on impossible. So to make up for that, you have tension, you have suspense, you have sort of psychological play, working with things like the uncanny, to sort of disarm people and unnerve them. And that's probably one of my favourite ways of working, is to sort of use something familiar that's changed slightly and changed so much that it will unease you. One of the great things about being a writer and an artist is obviously I do get to play with visual horror as well. In the artwork that I present, I can obviously show the characters, I can show antagonists if there are any, I can show gore if I want to. So that's an extra sort of addition to the writing as well, is that visual horror that sort of complements the story. One thing that you can do with visual horror is the act of turning a page as well, is obviously if you are surprised or shocked or amazed by an image that when you turn the page is suddenly there in front of you, it's not so much a jump scare as it is a realization. And it's a sort of a climax to hopefully the tension and the suspense that you've created in the writing leading up to that point. Right, next. What comes first, the illustration or the story? This is a really good question because it changes. It very much depends on the story and the character. Sometimes I'll have a character so firmly set in my head. I have their costume, I have what they look like, I have how they act, and I have to draw them. And they don't necessarily have a story yet. But as I'm doing things like researching their costume and checking their mannerisms and the way that they interact with me in my own head as I'm drawing them, I get an idea of what sort of story they want to tell. The other aspect of that is that sometimes I'll come up with an idea and a story, and I won't know what that person looks like until I start drawing them. Start writing them. And as I'm writing them, I'm describing them and I'm using, the descriptions to sort of embody them. And that with this book especially, I did find that it was a lot more organic. So I would draw a character and then I'd actually stop and I'd go to the writing and I'd write a little bit and I'd think, right, I'm going to describe them walking, I'm going to describe them doing this. And as I was doing that, they solidified in my head a bit more, and then I would draw them a bit more. And so it was a bit of more of a back and forth in this volume than the last one, which I think has worked really well for the sort of cohesiveness between the artwork and the actual writing. So yeah, another wishy-washy answer, I'm afraid, is that what comes first, the illustration or the story? It depends. It depends on the character and what sort of story comes out as they're being solidified, whether that's in art form or in story form. So next question. Is Dance of the Sea Serpent canon? Dance of the Sea Serpent, for those of you who don't know, was a short story that I wrote for a 2017 anthology called Cthulhu Cymraeg, which was a book of short stories that were inspired by the literary relationship between H.P. Lovecraft and the Welsh author Arthur Machen. All of them were either written or created by Welsh writers or inspired by Welsh landscapes and Welsh stories. And as a Welsh writer myself, I decided to draw upon the themes of insanity, the themes of the sea, And I basically ended up writing a story that was based in an asylum on a cliffside in North Wales that was having a circus visit the town. It was fresh off the back of Cirque Du Mort Volume 1. In fact, the editor kindly approached me after having read Cirque Du Mort Volume 1 and asked me to be a part of it. So I really wanted it to be Cirque Du Mort inspired, to the point that the circus that does visit actually has a blue haired ringmaster, and there is a black and white mime-like clown, which is very much based on Mimi from Volume 1. So it is very much firmly based in the Cirque Du Mort universe, and I do consider it a Cirque Du Mort story. In fact, it is actually one of the stretch goals, shameless plug, one of the stretch goals for this project is if I think we reach 5,000, which seems quite lofty. But yeah, if we reach 5,000, I will actually be illustrating the dance of the sea serpent. And I will be typesetting it in a similar style to the Cirque Du Mort books, so with postcards and playbills, etc. And sending it out as a high quality PDF to backers of, I believe, £10 or over. So anyone who has a physical copy of the book will also get a PDF copy of the Dance of the Sea Serpent, which will be illustrated, and that will be part of that. So it will officially be part of the Cirque Du Mort universe, if that would happen. Yeah, so next question. Where do you get most of the inspiration for your stories? This is another one from my mum. This is difficult because as I'm sure most creators of any kind, whether you're a writer or an artist or anything, we're sponges. So we sort of take inspiration from anywhere and everywhere, whether that's books, television, film. If you have a Pinterest board, like you take a lot of inspiration from a lot of different places. And in the case of the stories for this volume, they've all come from different ideas and different things. One of the stories I've previewed on the Kickstarter page is Estrella, who is the skeletal girl. And she was pretty much inspired by a place, which is the Isla de las Muñecas, excuse my pronunciation, which is just south of Mexico City, and it's the island of dead dolls, which is an amazing place. And I highly recommend you, if you have a strong stomach, to Google it. I have written it down on the Kickstarter page, so you don't have to rely on my poor pronunciation. But it's just a fascinating place, and that's what inspired that story. In the case of The Curious Tale of Euphemia Brown, that was actually a story that I wrote as part of my master's. We were asked to take a book of Neo-Victorian literature and take that inspiration and write our own Neo-Victorian story. And I took Diane Setterfield's The 13th Tale, in which there's a line in the story which I've got it written down just so I get it right, because I don't want to do Diane Setterfield and bad justice. But it's Isabel Anglefield was odd. Might be Angelfield if this everyone will have read it, not heard it. Isabel Angelfield was born during a rainstorm. It is impossible to know whether or not these facts are connected. And I took that line and used it for Euphemia Brown, who is the spirit writer in my story, and it was Euphemia Brown was odd, and I just wanted to explore why she was odd, what made her odd, what was the reason behind that. So yeah, sometimes it can be anything from a place to just a visual, to a book. One of my favorite stories in this collection is Panpharmacon, which is actually based on one of my favorite episodes of The X-Files, of all things. So it's taking inspiration from whatever, in some cases, scares you, in some cases asks you questions like, why was this person odd? And in some places makes you wonder as to the history of a place, in the case of the island of the dead dolls. So yeah, very broad answer to that question, I'm afraid. Next question. Are any of the characters in Cirque du Mort inspired by real people? This is a difficult one. Because on one hand, no, they are all completely fictional. You know, they're ghost stories that are made up out of, you know, sort of my love of horror and my love of horror movies and films, movies and TV and books. But on the other hand, you can't not be inspired by historical circus performers when you're looking up the sort of the history and the culture of circus performance and sideshow performance. The reason why I say it's a difficult one is because the idea of what we know of many of the Victorian and 19th century sideshow and circus performers is not necessarily true. A lot of the things that we know weren't necessarily written by the performers themselves. They would have been written by managers, they would have been written by promoters, written by barkers. And in the cases of sort of biographies of a lot of the people involved, again, we don't know how much is true and how much was exaggerated in order to sell pamphlets and in order to get butts on seats, as it were, in the circus. Essentially, a lot of circus performers were celebrities. They were creating a persona to try and get you to come and see them. So to sort of say that you're inspired by real people it's a difficult question, because we don't actually know the real people that were behind some of these amazing characters and performers. The masters that I did was studying sort of the history of women in sideshows and in the circus as circus performers in neo-Victorian literature. And so I did a lot of research into the history while I was doing that. And it's difficult, as I said, not to be inspired by so many of these amazing performers and the aesthetics and the iconic performance looks and costumes that they had. For example, Fedor Jeftichu, otherwise known as Jojo the Dog-Faced Boy, was a famous man with hypertrichosis. And he's very much the stylistic basis for one of the characters in Wolf Moon, which is one of the stories in this book. Annie Jones is a very famous bearded lady, and aesthetically is quite similar to Callista from Volume 1. So it is difficult not to take aesthetic nods from living people, but it's also very important to note that these are fictional ghost stories that aren't based on the real lives of true people. If anything, it's almost like I'm writing my own pamphlets for people who didn't exist, I suppose, or they're writing their own pamphlets. Next question. Is it right to say that some of the performers at the Cirque du Mort are sinners being punished? Some are victims given a kind of peace in the afterlife. If so, are you more drawn to one type of story than the other? This is a very deep question. For anyone who's read Volume 1 already, obviously some of the Cirque du Mort characters are definitely sinners. They are not all perfect. And some of them are definitely victims. In which case, the Cirque du Mort is a sort of a textual construct to gather these acts together, as it were, almost like the ringmaster is sort of like our crypt keeper, as it were. They're the sort of one that's bringing these stories together and collecting their stories and their ghosts and bringing them into the circus. So if I was to think of the circus as a real place that this person is gathering these stories into, it's very much a one man's heaven, one man's hell sort of situation, in the sense that you do have some of the characters that are living forever as ghosts, as performers being punished, whereas some of them are outsiders from life, or victims from life who now have a community of other outsiders and other victims who they are now a part of, and enjoyed performance and are now performing forever. So it's very much a one man's heaven, one man's hell situation, I think, there. As for if I'm drawn to more one story than the other, I think my answer would be, again, a mixture of both, because I love vengeance stories. Vengeance stories are always very fun to explore. And I think in the case of a vengeance story, when your character is the antagonist or the sort of the bad guy, as it were, in a lot of cases they are the victim as well. So there's that complication with a vengeance story of the almost anti-hero aspect of it, of someone going to an extreme case in order to get justice. And I think that's a very interesting sort of story to explore, especially in the realms of horror, because it's we do all love a bad guy in horror, and it's always interesting to make them complex. So yeah, I'd say that vengeance stories are probably my favourite sort to write, as is probably evidenced by quite a couple of them, to be honest. Okay, next story. Who goes on first, aside from the ringmaster, when the Cirque du Mort performs? Again, this is sort of coming from the idea that obviously the Cirque du Mort is a real place that gathers all these ghosts together, which I love. And that is something that I always wanted to explore. And it's actually something that I sort of talk about a little bit in the introduction to this book, which I didn't talk about in the first book. In the first book, I touched on the Cirque du Mort being a real place in the first poem, which comes up, which is Beware the Circus of Death, my dear. In this one, I'm actually doing a proper introduction, which shows the circus coming to town and shows you the point of view of a person walking into that circus and what they experience going into that circus, and this sort of ethereal, chaotic, dark energy that they have from visiting this circus. So it is something that I did want to develop over the stories of the idea of this place being real. So if this place was real, who would go on first? That is a very difficult question. If anything, because I haven't written all the characters yet, so I don't know who would be the most spectacular opener. But I can imagine that the Cirque du Mort would definitely be a three-ring circus. So the idea of 3 acts going on all at once. That's the sort of big, chaotic, dark energy that I think, the sort of the idea of a 3-ring circus would be perfect for the Cirque du Mort. And also the idea of those 3 acts representing, like if they were all going on at once, you could have one tragic character performing at the same time as a comedic character and at the same time as a dark character. And the idea of that tragic, comic darkness all going on at the same time in front of the audience is kind of encapsulates the idea of death itself, which is what the Cirque du Mort is all about. Because death it is tragic, but it can also be funny, and it is also dark. So the idea of mixing those 3 together in a 3-ring circus is kind of, I think that would encapsulate what the Cirque du Mort is all about. So in answer, I won't know until I've written everyone. But also a lot of the characters that you see wouldn't necessarily be big top stars. We've got the sideshows and we've got the characters who would be in the midway as well. Prospero Jones, who is a character in this, is a cardician, which involves a lot of close hand magic. He's the vagabond, he's the thief, he's the guy who plays, Catch the Red Lady under the cups. And that's the sort of thing that you need a close-up show for. But then you've also got characters like the traveling scientist from this volume, and Antoinette, and the snake charmer of the Dance of the Sea Serpent, who all have their own tents and this sort of very intense darkness to that tent, where you sort of step into it and you're almost stepping into another world when you go in. So yeah, the idea of there being one opening act and even a closing act is kind of not what the Cirque du Mort is all about. It's sort of going in, and instead of sitting down to watch a comfortable show with your popcorn and enjoy yourself, it's being constantly sort of these tidbits of lots of different places and going in and out until you find the tent that's meant for you, whatever that tent might be, whatever that story might be. So yeah, I think the answer to that would be, I don't know. I don't know who would be the first act on, but I have a pretty good understanding in my head of how chaotic it would be to go there, because I go there very regularly when I'm writing this. Okay, final question, which I think we're at 25 minutes, so that works out pretty well. This will turn into hopefully a good half hour. That question is, what is my favourite story from this volume? I'm really proud of the stories in this volume. I've been working on them full time, as it were, for the last few months. A lot of the stories, the first one that I wrote was actually all the way back in 2015, just after the sort of release of volume 1. I started working on the story of the skeletal girl, based on the fact that one of the stretch goals from that was to draw her. And as I was drawing her, I was sort of coming up with that story. But it didn't really solidify in my head until years later when I learned about this amazing island, and that's where the story just sort of blossomed. The other story, obviously, I've mentioned, I wrote during my master's. So they've all been popping into existence at different periods for a very long time now. And I've sort of fallen in love with some of them, to the point that I ended up obviously writing a story that won't be included in this one, that will hopefully be longer. I ended up writing a couple that I just didn't want to do horrible things to. I just fell so in love with them. I couldn't write them into a horror story. I had to find a different avenue for them somewhere. But from this volume, I'd probably say Panpharmacon, which is the contortionist story, is one of my favorites. As I said, it was based on one of my favorite episodes from, I say based on, inspired heavily by one of my favorite episodes of The X-Files, and any fan of The X-Files will be able to tell exactly which one as soon as they start reading it. That one was a really fun one to write, for the sort of her character is very interesting. It's a very interesting character. And I don't want to give away too much. That's the thing about short stories, is that I can't give away too much because they are only short. And the last thing I'd want to do is ruin the suspense. So I will just simply say Panpharmacon is one of my favorites. My other favorite would be Wolf Moon. And Wolf Moon is one of the final ones that I finished. And it's a love story. Which, as I said, with the other characters, I started writing them and I didn't have the avenue to explore with them that I was happy with. Whereas with Wolf Moon, there's these two women who I absolutely adore, and I sort of loved exploring their relationship and just the sort of little romantic gestures that they have between each other and their friendship coming over throughout this story. I think I found an avenue that I was happy with. And yeah, just those two. I just fell in love with the characters of that story, and it was just a good fun one to write. It's also, being the most recent one that I finished, it has elements of it that were inspired by lockdown and writing in lockdown. The idea of being separated from people and the social anxiety that comes with it, and the sort of the anger and the tiredness that comes with a scary situation. All of that very much fed into it in a way that I didn't really notice until after I finished the story. So it's quite it's one that I'm very proud of. So I'd say Wolf Moon and Panpharmacon are two of my favorites from this volume. But considering that there are 10 stories, that's a fifth of the book. So there are some I'm very proud of all of the stories in this book. There's that's the questions that I have been sent in. I don't believe that I have any more that are coming in through Facebook or YouTube. I know that it's a very hot day. Not many people really want to be sat in front of their computers or on their phones watching me being, all hot and sweaty in my living room either. So for those of you who have joined us this evening, thank you. For those of you who are watching later, I hope you enjoyed some of the questions that were sent. The Kickstarter is still live. It's only been on for about 4 days, and it is already at 2,104, as we mentioned earlier. That's 84% funded. I'm just checking my little app on my phone right now. There's 26 days left. One question, actually, that I've just thought of, which isn't a question that's been asked for the Q&A, but it's more of a question that came up during the first days when I was launching the Kickstarter, is why am I using Kickstarter? Which is a completely valid question. And I used Kickstarter for the first volume, and it's a brilliant way of getting to an audience that I wouldn't necessarily have met. And one of the things I love about Kickstarter is it's a fantastic community of people who support other independent creators, whether you're creating a board game or a horror book or a movie or an album or any number of amazing things. All of the creators are in it together, and that's a really nice feeling. It's a great sort of way to network, as it were, with other writers and other artists, and to see their work that you wouldn't necessarily have seen, and them to see you. It's a great way of getting new horror fans coming in to read the book. And it's a great way of using it as a pre-ordering tool, which obviously large publishers use all the time to sort of gauge how many books to print and how many copies to make for people. So it's just a really good way of interacting and fulfilling orders with people who are passionate about creating projects, as passionate as you are, and passionate about supporting independent creators as well. So yeah, it's just it's a great community. I've been sort of a part of it since I first did the first Kickstarter, and sort of on and off throughout that time. And coming back to it now as a creator again is really good fun. Just sort of messaging other creators and meeting all of my backers and finding sort of new people who are as excited for this project as I am, which is very. So yeah, if anyone is watching this and hasn't seen the Kickstarter yet, please check the description underneath the video. There is a link to the Kickstarter there. Obviously, we're very close to reaching our goal at the moment. Kickstarter is an all or nothing website. So if we don't reach the goal, then we don't get anything. And if we do reach the goal, then we have some amazing stretch goals planned for you, including some additions to all of the different rewards, things like embroidered patches, new stories, previews from volume 3. So yeah, hopefully we will get to 2,500 soon, and I can start, well, I've already started, but I can continue making this book for you. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say, really. I hope that you'll consider backing the Kickstarter, and if you already are, thank you for getting us this far, and I look forward to making the book for you. Have a great evening, guys.